who's with us in the service so far, through the worship, through the notices, through the offering. Lord, we pray now that you'll continue to be with us as we hear from you from your word. Lord, you know our hearts, you know our needs. We pray that you'll speak to us in Jesus' name. Amen. Has this moved a little? Can we just move it slightly back? Thank you. Well, this morning in the series on Isaiah, we come to Isaiah 41. The topic that I was given was the Lord for his people. But I want just to take a minute or two by introduction to think about the difference between Isaiah 1 to 39 and Isaiah chapters 40 to 66. We know that Isaiah prophesied from somewhere around 740 BC, and he died sometime after 681 BC. And most of the prophecies in chapters 1 to 39 related to events that happened during his lifetime, particularly the destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria, although he also looks a little towards the time when Judah was taken into exile in Babylon in 596 and 586 BC. And that event was a devastating blow, the exile, when Israel was taken from its homeland into Babylon. It was a devastating blow to the people, many of whom thought that God had abandoned them. But God gave Isaiah the tremendous privilege of seeing the hope beyond the judgment. And in Isaiah chapters 46 to 66, Isaiah prophesies, or more accurately, God speaks through Isaiah about the return from exile in Babylon back to the land of Palestine, which took place in 538 BC when King Cyrus, who had overrun Babylon, gave the Israelites permission to return to their homeland. We read about that in the book of Ezra. So God not only predicted that Israel was going to go into exile, but God, for Isaiah, predicted that they were going to return from exile. And that must have brought Isaiah tremendous comfort and hope. There is a lesson in that, I think, for us as we think this morning. We may be facing difficulties in one way or other, whether it's as individuals, as a family, or a nation. But just as God gave Isaiah the privilege of seeing the comfort that lay beyond the difficulty, so in our own lives, God wants us to see that there is hope that lies beyond our difficulties. We don't need some prophet, some modern-day prophet to come in and tell us that we have that hope, because we're given that assurance in the Scriptures. God has made it very clear, both through the example of the Israelites and through specific promises, that there is hope beyond suffering, and that God doesn't abandon us in our suffering, and there is always relief beyond it, whether in this life or in the life to come. And just as that encouraged and strengthened Isaiah had that tremendous privilege of seeing that hope from a distance, even though he never lived to see it. We too have that tremendous privilege of knowing that whatever difficulty we're going through, there is hope beyond it, whether it is restoration in this life or in our time in heaven. And the hope too that God is working out his good purposes in it. And so Isaiah had that privilege of seeing beyond the difficulties to the hope that lay ahead. And that must have brought him great comfort as someone who loved the people whom he had been called to prophesy to. And it should encourage us too as well, that beyond whatever we're going through, there is hope. So this is just a little thing by introduction, because the structure of Isaiah has much to teach us. Chapters 1 to 39, mainly judgment. Chapters 40 to 66, comfort and hope. And that was true for Israel, that was true for Isaiah, and it's true for us too. Well, with that little introduction, let's look at the chapter 41. We looked at chapter 40 last week. And chapter 41, verses 1 to 7, God is speaking to the nations, and he's challenging them about their reliance on their false gods. Let me begin by reading verse 1. Be silent before me, you islands, let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak. Let us meet together at the place of judgment. So God has a case against the nations, as he will explain in the remaining verses. And in verses 2 to 4, he emphasizes that he is in control of history. Who has stirred up the one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them and moves on unscathed, by a path whose feet have not travelled before. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them and with the last of them, I am he. Now in those verses, God is prophesying what was going to happen in the return from exile. The ruler from the east is King Cyrus, who was king of Persia. Persia is to the east of Palestine. And God used Cyrus, as I said a moment ago, to conquer Babylon and to set the Israelites free. And it mentions here about their bows, because the Persians were very skilled in archery. Cyrus wasn't a believer in the God of Israel, and yet God still used him. In fact, later on in chapter 45, God calls him his servant, his anointed one. And what God is saying through this is that God controls what goes on among the nations. And he's saying that this is not something new. God's use of Cyrus is not unique. He's been doing this throughout the generations, from the first generation to the last. What happens among the nations is under the control of God. God is in control, he's saying, of the events of history. God is in control even of the unbelieving rulers of the world. He controls and he directs their actions, even if they don't acknowledge him. There's a verse in Proverbs chapter 21 verse 1 which says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." Rulers think they're in control, but behind them, God is controlling and directing them. And there's so much in the Bible that illustrates this, not simply in the historical circumstances that Isaiah is talking about Babylon being used by God to judge Israel, and Persia being used by God to rescue Israel from the Babylonians. But we also see it much earlier, where God says, "I raised up Pharaoh so that I might display my glory in all the earth." And we see it later on. One of the aspects of the Christmas story I love is the image of this great and mighty Caesar Augustus. And he decides, I want to know how many people I have in my great empire. And so he orders a survey, which means that all the adult males have to go back to their hometown so that they can be registered, so Caesar can know how many people he has. But why did that really happen? It was because God wanted one baby to be born in Bethlehem, in Judea. Caesar thought he was controlling his empire, but behind him, God was controlling the events. And of course we see it supremely in Jesus' death. We know that at a human level, Pilate and the Romans were responsible for putting Jesus to death. And they'll be called to account for what they did. But Peter says on the day of Pentecost that although they did it, it happened within the providence and the foreknowledge of God. So what we're seeing in this passage is a wonderful illustration of something that comes throughout the Bible. I should have added in the book of Revelation. One of the themes of the book of Revelation is that God is in control of history. God is in control of the nations. What happens, even when bad things happen among the nations, God is still in control and working out his purposes. And what was true at the time of Isaiah, what was true at other times in the Bible, is true today. God is still in control of the nations. God is still working out his purposes in what happens. At the minute, there's tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia, if you're watching the news. And it's worrying. But God is in control of what's happening. In the UK at the minute, there's absolute chaos over Brexit, for any of you following the news. And you wonder what these politicians are up to. And yet God is in control of the politicians. And what's true there is true also of Nigeria. We look at the state of the country and the many, many problems and challenges that there are. And yet God is in control of events in Nigeria. We don't need a prophet to come up today to tell us that God is in control, because Scripture has already told us this. That is the message from Isaiah's time for us today, that God is in control of events and we need to believe and to trust him. So moving on to verses 5 to 7, let me read them. God is challenging the nations here. The nation's response to all this political uncertainty is to trust in idols. But this is what God says. The islands have seen it and fear. The ends of the earth tremble. They approach and come forward. They help each other and say to their companions, "Be strong." The metal worker encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer spurs on the one who strikes it with the anvil. He's talking about the people who make images, who make gods. One says of the welding, "It is good." The other nails down the idol so it will not topple. Instead of trusting in the God of Israel to protect them, the nations at the time of Isaiah, they trusted in idols. But God just points out the foolishness of doing so. What are idols but things made by man? And those who say that they're satisfied with their workmanship, they say it's good. But these idols, they can't even stand up on their own. They need to be nailed in place. Otherwise they will topple over. It's foolish, God says, to trust in idols. And of course the application for us today is that we need to trust in God, not false gods. And in these politically uncertain times, there's a challenge to us. Where are we placing our trust? Is it in alternative politicians? Is it in the lawmakers or the courts? Is it in electoral commissions or CAN? They all have their place and God can use them. But ultimately, people and institutions disappoint us. Our trust should be in God. He may not always tell us what he's going to do or how he will do it. But we know from Scripture that he's controlling events and he calls us to trust him. So don't trust in political idols. Trust in God to sort our problems. There's another thought I just want to pick up from verses 1 to 7 before moving on. It's not the main thought, but it's a very, very interesting and powerful thought. And that comes in verse 1, where God says, "Be silent before me, you islands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak. Let us meet together at the place of judgment." Now this is a really interesting idea. God is calling the nations. He has a case against the nations. And his purpose in bringing that case against the nations is so that they can renew their strength. Often it's when we meet God at the place of judgment, when God corrects our wrong attitudes, our wrong thoughts, our wrong reliances, and deals with our sins, that we renew our strength. What's said here is an echo of what Isaiah, God has already said to Isaiah in chapter 40. There he talks about the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary. But then Isaiah goes on to say, he gives strength to the weary, he increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men who stumble and fall, but those who wait upon the Lord, or who hope upon the Lord, will renew their strength. There is a renewal of strength that comes through ordinary, regular fellowship, day-to-day fellowship with God. But in chapter 41, he's saying there is another kind of renewal of strength. And that is when we meet God in the place of judgment. We know, as Christians more clearly, that the place of judgment is the cross, where Christ was judged in our place, taking our sins upon himself, so that as our substitute, so that we might be forgiven and the power of sin might be broken in us. And so when we accept God's righteous judgment on us as sinners, we find grace, we find forgiveness, we find reconciliation, we find redemption, we find relief from our burdens. And so the place of judgment is also a place of grace. It's hard work, I think, trusting other things than God. It's hard work holding on to our sins. It's hard work running away from God. And maybe this morning God is calling some of us, come and meet me at the place of judgment, which is also the place of grace, the place where I deal with those things in your life that need to be corrected, that need to be forgiven. And if that's the case, don't resist him. If he's calling you to that place of judgment, which is a place of grace that brings strength, answer his call. We long for God's presence in ordinary fellowship, and that is sweet and beautiful. And we gain strength from that. But we also gain strength when we meet God in the place of judgment, where he corrects what needs to be corrected and what needs to be forgiven in our lives. So just hold on to that thought. It's a profound thought coming from the passage. Well, the second main section in these verses is the section that Bosque read for us, verses 8 to 20, where God speaks to Israel to encourage Israel. And those verses have a primary application to Israel at the time. And God was emphasizing to Israel that even though she was sent into exile, God has not abandoned her, God has not given up on her. He's still their God, and he promises their return from exile, and he promises that the land will be restored. And that has a fulfillment historically in Israel at the time shortly after Isaiah. And many people believe it may have an end time fulfillment around the time Christ returns. But there is a secondary application of these verses in that they apply spiritually to us today as believers. Because the God of Israel is our God. And what he did for Israel is a picture of what he does spiritually for us today. And so I want to look at these, looking at that dual aspect of what it meant for Israel and what it means to us today. So in verses 8 to 10, God emphasizes through Isaiah that he has not given up on Israel. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth. From its farthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant. I've chosen you and not rejected you. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Israel had rejected God, and it led to them being taken in exile in a foreign country in Babylon. But God said to Israel, the exile does not mean that he has rejected them. Now at that time, all the different nations, they had different gods. And people believed that if one nation conquered another nation, what it meant was that the gods of the conquering nation were stronger than the gods of the nation that had been conquered. And that the gods of the nation that had been conquered were not strong enough to resist the gods of the conquering nation. Now what did that mean for Israel? Many people in Israel at the time thought that the exile meant that Yahweh, the God in whom they'd been trusting, had been defeated. That he wasn't as strong as the gods of Babylon. But what God had done through Isaiah, by declaring in advance exactly what was going to happen, not only the exile, but also the return, he was teaching Israel that is not the case. Your exile doesn't mean that I'm defeated by Babylon, God is saying. The exile is part of my plan. I declared long beforehand it would happen because Babylon was under my control. And God declared long beforehand that the Israelites would return so that when it happens they would know that God had not been defeated, but all these events were under his control because he is the one supreme God. Do you see how by prophesying these events beforehand, God was making clear that the events did not mean that he was defeated, but rather that he was in control. So that's the connection there. And so God speaks to the Israelites in this situation, saying clearly that he's not defeated, that he is still their God. He says, I took you from the ends of the earth, probably Mesopotamia, where Abraham came from Egypt, as we know, during the Exodus. He says, I chose you. Deuteronomy makes very clear that he chose Israel not because Israel was better than any of the other nations, but out of his love, out of his sovereign choice. And he calls Israel his servant, because Israel was to be the vehicle through whom he would make himself known to the nations. And because of that, Israel should know that God has not rejected him. God does not reject his people whom he has chosen. And so what does he say? Because of this, do not fear, he says to Israel, because I am with you. In verse 10, do not be dismayed, for I am your God, the God who predicted all these events, who is in control of them. I am your God. He's still with them despite the suffering they're going through. And what does he promise to Israel? He promises, I will strengthen you. Again, that word from Isaiah 40 and verse 1 as well. I will help you. I'll uphold you with my righteous right hand. Now all of us know we need a helping hand sometimes. Sometimes Well, some years ago I broke my foot when I was playing football. Believe it or not, I used to play football. And when I broke my foot, I needed somebody because I couldn't walk. I needed someone to help me move. And we've all been, well, many of us have been in that situation. Or we've been in a situation where we're walking and we stumble and somebody just steadies us and helps us. And that's just a little picture of what God was saying He was doing for Israel. Trust in me and I will steady you despite the chaos that's going on in your circumstances. I am going to be your right, hold you by your right hand. I will steady you. I will be your rock. I'll be your strength. Now what I want to say is that what was true of Israel is true for us. And as we explore this, I'm aware that some of us, this may just be a general encouragement, and that is good. But I'm aware that some of us may be going through difficult times, whether as individuals or as a family. And I'm aware that some of us, like Israel, maybe we are aware of sin in our lives, and we're aware of that we deserve God's wrath. And so let these words of Scripture speak to whatever your circumstances this morning. But what's the first thing that we learn? The first thing we learn is that in the same way that God chose Israel, He's chosen us. He may not have taken us from the ends of the earth literally, but He's rescued us from all kinds of sin. Even those of us who are privileged to have come from a good Christian background, we're aware of who we would have become had we not had that background, of the kind of people we would be today were it not for God's grace. Secondly, just like God called Israel, He has called us. He's chosen us. Now many people, they think they have chosen Christ. And particularly if we've gone through some kind of struggle before we make a decision to follow Him, that's how we think. But as we mature in our Christian lives and our Christian understanding, gradually we realize that we did not choose Christ, but He chose us, and that He drew us to Himself in His love. And that humbles us because we know, why me? I don't deserve it. But it encourages us because it means that we are special to God. We matter to Him. God has chosen us like He chose Israel. He's called us like He chose Israel. And He's, just like He called Israel to serve Him, so He's called us to serve Him. God not only calls us to know Him, but He's called us to serve Him. Now that doesn't necessarily mean becoming a pastor or a missionary. It was great to see the picture of John David, for those of us who remember him, there being ordained. And if God calls you to be ordained, that is wonderful. But God doesn't call everybody to be ordained as a pastor. I'm not ordained, I'm a teacher. Right? I'm happy being a Marlon. If God calls you to be a pastor, fine. For me, I'm Marlon, because that's what God has called me to do. But some of you have been called to be civil servants. Some of you have been called to serve God by being teachers. Some of you have been called to serve God by being traders in the market. And as I mentioned earlier, some of us have been called to serve God by being mechanics, and I thank God for Peter, who helped us out when our car stopped the other week. God bless you, sir. And what matters is that we know God's calling on our lives. No one calling is higher than another calling. What matters is that we do God's will, and that we are salt and light in the community, being used by God and serving God where they are. And that is true of welders and of mechanics, of farm workers, as it is of pastors. We are called by God to know Him and to serve Him. And whatever you are doing is a calling from God. And be encouraged that it is not second best. And use your situation to influence the people you work with in society for God's kingdom. Just as God did not reject Israel, God does not reject us. People often think when they're going through times of suffering or difficulty, through tough times, that God has abandoned them. Where is God? Why has God allowed this to happen in my life? And I often use when I'm teaching an illustration from the book The Concubine by Eleke Amadi. I don't know if you know that book, but when I first came to Nigeria, which wasn't very long ago, it was about nearly 25 years anyway, but I tried to read some of the African Christian writers' books because they give such an insight into traditional African culture. But if you know that story, you know that Emineke, who's the concubine's wife, he has a fight with Madumeni, who's also interested in the woman. And Emineke is much stronger than Madumeni, but in the course of their fight, he falls to the ground, but he falls on a tree stump, a sharp tree stump, and it enters his side. And he loses the fight and he eventually dies. And what's really interesting is that Amadi, his comment is, his God was not with him on that day. And I think sometimes as Christians we're tempted to think that when we go through suffering or difficulty, that God is not with us. And yet, God said to Israel, through Isaiah, even though you are in exile, you're in a foreign country, you're owned by a foreign nation, I've not abandoned you. And I'm reminded, of course, of the story of Joseph. We know that so well, but Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, and he is a slave in Potiphar's house. But what does Genesis tell us? God was with him. And then shortly afterwards, he gets falsely accused of attempted rape, and he gets put into prison. But what does Genesis tell us? God was with him. And what is God saying to us through this passage today? God is with us. Whatever trial or difficulty we're going through, whether individually or as a family or a nation, God has not abandoned us. He is with us. Why? Because He's chosen us. He wants us. We are His people. We belong to Him. And so just as God said to Israel, do not fear, for I'm with you, so He says to us, do not fear, because He's with us. In verses 14 and 15, He says, do not be afraid, you worm Jacob. I'm not sure I want to be called a worm, but, worms, they're not strong. And, if you see a snake will raise its head to you, but a worm will just slither away to get out of the way. But anyway, that was Jacob. Jacob meaning the southern kingdom of Israel. But he says, little Israel, do not fear. Why? For I myself will help you, declares the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. God helped Israel and was present with Israel in their suffering. He told them not to fear. And God says to us today, whatever we're going through, do not fear, because He is with us. He will uphold us. He is our right hand. He will hold us by His right hand. Now, I've skipped 2 verses, so let me skip that. Sorry, I was looking at the clock, but I will still finish on time by God's grace. In verses 11 and 12, what does God say to them? He says in verses 11 and 12, I will protect you from your enemies. That's what he said to Israel. That's what he says to us today. All who rage against you will surely be ashamed and disgraced. Those who oppose you will be as nothing and perish. Though you search for your enemies, you will not find them. Those who wage war against you will be as nothing at all. Who are our enemies today? Well, we face all kinds of enemies. Not only Boko Haram and the militant herdsmen and kidnappers and armed robbers, but people who oppose us at work, maybe even people within our own family. And as I was thinking about this for the sermon, the reality is that some people do get killed by their enemies. So what does this promise mean? Well, I think what it means is that nothing can happen to us unless God allows it. That if tomorrow I get beheaded by Boko Haram, I'm not a prophet, I hope it doesn't happen, but if that were to happen, my wife probably hopes it doesn't happen, if that were to happen, it can only happen because God has allowed it. Sometimes, in God's sovereignty, He chooses to call people home through violent means. I don't know why. If I were God, I wouldn't do it like that. But we know that God sometimes does. And we trust Him that if bad things happen to His people, it is because that is His time to call them home. It doesn't contradict the promise here that the bad thing is the means that God uses to call somebody home. So God promises protection from enemies. He tells us not to fear, as I've just mentioned. And then in verses 15 and 16, He promises that He'll remove any obstacle from our way. Let me just read these verses. See, I will make you into a threshing sledge. Now, you know what it is. We have these things for beating rice or maize or different things to get the husks off them. And that's the kind of thing that Isaiah is talking about here. And I'll make you into a threshing sledge, new and sharp, with many teeth. You will thresh the mountains and crush them, and reduce the hills to chaff. And you will winnow them. That means you toss it up in the air, and the wind will blow away, will pick them up, and the gale will blow them away. But you will rejoice in the Lord, and glory in the Holy One of Israel. Now this is an interesting image that God says He will reduce the mountains and the hills that Israel would face on their long journey back from Babylon to Palestine to something like chaff. Did He physically remove them for Israel? No, actually. But God gave them such strength and such joy in their return that the mountains seemed nothing to them on their journey. And when it comes to us, sometimes, yes, God removes the mountains physically from our lives, the difficulties that we're going through. But very often, His way of removing them is not physically, but by giving us the strength to walk through those mountains, so that those mountains that seemed so big, those obstacles that we thought we can't overcome, become small in our eyes, because God gives us the strength to face them. He gives us the wisdom to deal with them. God will remove the obstacles in our lives, sometimes physically, but very often by giving us the strength to endure through them. And then in verses 17 to 19, He says that the land will be restored, and God's going to abundantly bless Israel. Let's just read them. The poor and needy will search for water, but there is none. The poor and needy search, present tense, for water, but there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst. Let me just demonstrate. That's better. But I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will make rivers flow on barren heights, and springs within the valleys. I will turn the desert into pools of water, and the parched ground into springs. I will put in the desert the cedar and the acacia, the myrtle and the olive. I will set junipers in the wasteland, and fir and the cypress together. These are the most beautiful and wondrous trees. So 2 images. Water everywhere in order to quench people's thirst, and trees everywhere to give people protection and shade. And what God is saying to us through this is that just as God supplied Israel's needs, so He will supply our needs today. Whether that be physical, like water, whether that be emotional, like comfort, or whether it be spiritual. And in particular, I want to just say something about spiritual dryness, because this passage has a particular relevance to those of us who may be experiencing spiritual dryness. Spiritual dryness is where we long for God, and we are praying, and we're reading our Bibles, and we're involved in church activities, and yet somehow God seems far away. Somehow we can't just break through to God. Now sometimes God allows spiritual dryness because He wants to deepen our thirst. He wants to make us more thirsty so that we will long for Him even more. Jeremiah 29:13 says, "You will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart." Sometimes, though, God allows us to go through times of spiritual dryness because He wants to deepen our trust so that we are not dependent on feelings, but we are dependent on the promises of God. It's very easy for us to get stuck in the feelings-orientated Christianity where when we feel God's presence we're fine, but when we don't feel God's presence we're a wreck. And some of us are like that. There was somebody who once said, "I believe in the sun when it is not, even when it's not shining. I believe in love even when I do not feel it. And I believe in God even when He is silent." And God sometimes leads us through times of spiritual dryness to actually wean us off dependency on our feelings so that we love and we trust God and we have the comfort of knowing that He's present with us and in control even though we may not feel it. That is an aspect of spiritual maturity. Thank God that this Christian life is a mixture of experience and trust. We need those times of experience. They deepen our trust. But sometimes we need times of spiritual dryness to help us to realize that these things are still true even when we don't feel them. Then in verse 20, God says why He's doing this. He says, "I'm doing all this so that people may see and know, may consider and understand that the hand of the Lord has done this, that the Holy One of Israel has created it." When God brought the Jews out of exile in Babylon back to their homeland, everybody knew that God was God. God was faithful. God had predicted it and God did it. And similarly, when God does good things in our lives, we know it and we honour Him, and other people see it and they are encouraged and they honour Him. Now these are tremendous and great and wonderful promises. But some of us may be thinking, well, how do I know that these are true? How can I be really sure that these things are true for me? Well, I'm going to read the last section of Isaiah and make a couple of very brief comments that relate back to that question. So let's read verses 21 to 29. Again, God here is talking to the nations. Present your case, says the Lord. Set forth your arguments, says Jacob's king. Tell us, you idols, what is going to happen. Tell us what the former things were, so that we may consider them and know what is their final outcome. Or declare it to us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds, so that we may know you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear. But you are less than nothing, and your works are utterly worthless. Whoever chooses you is detestable. Then God says, I have stirred up the one from the north, and he comes. He comes from the rising sun, who calls on my name. So this is Cyrus. He comes from the east, but he comes historically through the north. There's the imagery there. He treads on rulers as if they were a mortar, as if he were a potter treading the clay. Who told of this from the beginning, so that we could know, or beforehand, so that we could say he was right? No one told of this, no one foretold it, no one heard any words from you, that is, the gods. I was the first to tell Zion, look, here they are. I gave Jerusalem a messenger of good news. That was the prophet Isaiah. I look, but there is no one among the gods to give counsel, no one to give answer when I ask them. See, they're false. Their deeds amount to nothing, and their images but wind and confusion. Now you might say, how does that relate to what God has just said? Well, I'm going to make one simple explanation. But just notice, this is very similar to what he said in verses 1 to 7 about the worthlessness of the gods. But whereas in verses 1 to 7 he says they can't stand up on their own, they even need to be nailed in place. Here he says they're silent, they can't answer. They can't tell you what happened before, they can't tell you about the future. These gods are worthless. But by contrast, God, the God of Israel, he predicted long ago what was going to happen. And his words come true. And that teaches us that his word can be trusted, that his promises are sure. Now can you see how that relates back? These great and wonderful promises, you might say, how can I know that they are true in my life? And God says, look, in the life of Israel, what I said came true. And in your life, what I say will come true. Because I, the Lord, have spoken it. God's word is faithful. We don't need a modern-day prophet to come and tell us that. God has demonstrated this in the life of the nation of Israel. And that encourages us that what he says to us will also come true. So just as God at the time of Isaiah encouraged them with his presence, encouraged them that he'd not abandoned them, encouraged them to serve him, encouraged them that he will help them with their enemies, encouraged them that he will help them deal with the obstacles in their life, and encourage them that he will provide for them spiritually as well as physically and emotionally. So God is calling us to trust him that he will do these things in our life too. So be encouraged. The God of Israel, the God of Jacob, is our God. And he calls us to trust him because he's going to work in our lives just as he worked in the life of the nation of Israel. And as we began, If you are going through suffering and difficulty, as all of us are as a nation in one way or another, learn that lesson from the structure of Isaiah to see beyond the difficulty to the hope. Because it is real, it is certain, it is sure, because God has promised it. Let us pray. Our Father, we thank you for your word. Lord, this is encouraging. We thank you that you are a God who speaks to our situation, to our needs. And when we are down, you lift us up, you uphold us. And I pray, Lord, today that as we've heard this message from your word, that as we face the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the rest of the year, whatever it may come, we may hold on to these great and wonderful promises and trust in you. Give us that grace, we pray. We commit ourselves to doing so. We ask for grace to do so in Jesus' name. Amen.